Here on SA Today, well, journalists around the world are playing a crucial role in keeping the public informed about the COVID-19 pandemic and government efforts to combat it. At the same time, the sector is facing challenges just when the world needs it the most. Meanwhile, South African National Editors Forum says although the media plays such a vital role amidst the coronavirus pandemic, the industry is under severe threat. As we continue with that story, we welcome journalist and a political analyst, Khanyi Magubane, as well as a chairperson of the African Editors Forum, Mr. Jovial Rantao. Thank you very much for joining us on SA Today, to both of you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just as a start, I'll come to you, Khanyi. You know, we watched a clip just before this chat, and you were saying something quite interesting about the fact that, you know, we're seeing, you know, the closing of Associate Media Publishing after 38 years in business, and the fact that there might not be so much of a reliance on print media. With this kind of a challenge, and we have seen other media houses also having to close their doors, what exactly does Press Freedom Day sort of mean to you as someone who is in the media space, who is a media practitioner, and seeing these threats to the press and the media at large?
Thank you very much to you, Flo. I think that we mark World Press Freedom Day in a very interesting time. I mean, we know that a lot of media companies have been hit hard by the coronavirus. The lockdown has necessitated many media houses to close their doors. And this, of course, has impacted on the bottom line. And we know that it is not a problem that started today. A lot of media houses have been facing economic difficulties for a long time, but it is exacerbated by the current landscape. You know, Flo, as we celebrate World Press Freedom Day today, we need to understand where it comes from and really where, you know, the need to have this day comes from. The World Press Freedom Day was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in 1993 as a way to remind governments of the world that they need to protect the right of the media to have its freedom, the right for journalists to do their jobs without fear or favor, which in fact happens to be the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day 2020. It's journalism without fear and favor. And in South Africa, while we have seen our journalists out and about in their numbers covering the COVID-19 pandemic, in many other countries, it hasn't been so easy. We've seen many governments suppressing and censoring journalists from truly revealing the true state of the pandemic in specific countries. And in fact, we know that Reporters Without Borders have released the 2020 Press Freedom Index in April, and there were many countries like Iran and Iraq which were right at the bottom, number 162 for Iraq and 173 for Iran, and there was a correlation between the oppression of the media from reporting on coronavirus. You must remember that there's been different reactions, and some governments have responded to it by saying at first it was a conspiracy theory, it's terrorists trying to instill fear. So there was a lot of misinformation about what the coronavirus was initially, and journalists who were covering the COVID-19 spread were targeted by some authoritarian governments, and they were actually imprisoned. Some of them were abducted overnight and taken in for questioning. So as we are marking this day, we need to remember the global picture, that the landscape for journalists in other countries is not perhaps the way it is in South Africa. We know that in South Africa, press freedom is protected by the Constitution. However, the landscape for many other journalists is very different. In fact, some journalists have been silenced, from actually, showing the world what is truly happening in those countries, which then also says perhaps some of the figures we see being reported may not truly reflect the full picture in other countries where we are seeing an oppression of information and a suppression of information getting out.
Yeah, Jovial, let me just bring you in in here. You were the press ombuds and, chairperson of the African Editors Forum. I mean, this must be very scary for you, for someone who's been involved in the press and media for such a long time, to see all these media houses having to close their doors, particularly those in print. What is your reaction at this time, especially today as we celebrate World Freedom Day for the press?
I just wanted to say first that it is important, as my sister there outlined the history of World Press Freedom Day. It's very important for us to recognize that this important day has its foundations in Africa. 29 years ago, journalists and media practitioners met in Windhoek to look at the promotion of an independent and pluralistic press. And out of that came the Windhoek Declaration, which called for a pluralistic and independent media. That declaration was then taken to the UN and became the basis of the UN declaring today World Press Freedom Day. And it's a model that was copied by many other countries in Latin America, many other countries in the Middle East, and so on. So I think it's important for us to recognize the historic place that meeting that was held in Namibia, 4-day seminar from the 29th to the 3rd of May in 1991, what that has led to. But in direct response to your question, I think it is quite clear to everybody that while the media has been under a lot of pressure, particularly the print media, that the onset of coronavirus is forcing all of us to press the big reset button. It means that the economic downturn that we see affecting all other industries in our country and beyond, that it has also touched the media in a very bad way. We see journalists being asked to take salary cuts, and in South Africa, the magazines are closing down. In countries such as Algeria, Morocco, up in North Africa, media houses have had to close, albeit temporarily, but there are fears that this publication, all of them will come back. But that points out to the fact that it cannot be business as usual for media companies.
Yeah, Jovial, I wanted to look at another situation, and that is, of course, that of, the journalists being sort of under threat and the censoring of journalists. Is freedom of the press still an issue in South Africa? I mean, is there some sort of cause for concern in that regard? I mean, if you're mentioning some other countries in Africa that are having to close down, but in terms of freedom of the press, would you not say, and maybe I'm naive, I'm looking at it from the point of South Africa, where really journalists, reporters are often very free to say what they want about politicians, for example. But when you look at it, and for a person that of course is an editor, do you think that there is some sort of, or still is, censoring of journalists and people in the media, in your view?
I think South Africa is one of those lucky nations in Africa where freedom of the media and independence of the media is promoted and protected. There are still instances that are cause for worry for us. For instance, when journalists go out to do their stories, there's always endless run-ins with the police or law enforcement authorities who do not understand the role of the media. People are either chased away, cameras confiscated, and so on. But South Africa position doesn't mean that we should all relax, because this freedom that we enjoy in this country, this freedom of the media and independence, also must be protected. So we need to remain vigilant. If you look at the current regulations that are passed now in South Africa to deal with COVID, some of them violate all kinds of rights that people have. The the communications regulations that have been passed allow government to trace all of us and so on. So we need to be vigilant and take steps to make sure that those kind of regulations, well-meaning as they may be, intended to help stop the spread of this virus, are not abused. We do not want to have situations where journalists who are viewed to be publishing or working on stories that people do not like, that these journalists are either followed, traced, or were still listened into on their phone. So we are freer than most nations in Africa, but even this freedom is worth protecting jealously so.
All right, Khanyi, let me bring you back in here. I mean, with freedom that, Jovial and I are just discussing here, there also does come a level of responsibility that those of us in the media space must really adhere to. How do we balance, that freedom and the responsibility, especially, in the era of fake news and the need to be first to report and sometimes then not reporting factually? Is the press more than ever perhaps also getting it wrong and should take accountability in that regard? Because, this also then talks to the issue of trust.
Absolutely. Things like social media have also played a role in rushing the media to break the story. And sometimes media houses have done so prematurely before completely establishing all the facts. And I think that the media has a responsibility, especially editors and your senior staff, has the responsibility to always bring it back to the basics of factual reporting, because people need to trust what the media says. When a particular media house publishes any information, the consumers need to trust that information. And I think that what has happened, especially, in the past few years, is that the media space has become quite competitive, and we've seen media houses in some cases being taken to court, over factual inaccuracies, being asked to do retractions. And also we've seen social media corrections where media houses are saying, we got this wrong. We relied on sources that gave us wrong information. So nothing beats the good old-fashioned verify your information before you publish it, the who, where, what, and how. Those journalism 101 basics, even up until today, they are still necessary, because ultimately journalists are seekers of truth, and journalists themselves and the media as a whole needs to guard its own independence, like my learned colleague there and Jovial Rantao was saying. And also we know that there's always political interference. Journalists themselves have to guard, against being used by politicians and political factions, in their reporting. The media itself has to regulate its own independence, and being objective, of course, is something that is said to be in the past and that the media is embedded. But as a journalist, as somebody who calls themselves a journalist, even in my sphere of political analysis, but at the core of what I do is give information to the public, and people need to say that Flow is a credible source. Jovial is a credible source. Khanyi is a credible source, because they trust the work and they trust the integrity that we put in our work. However, the pressures of the newsroom cannot be denied, Flow. There is a lot of pressure. We see journalists struggling, a high turnover of journalists, the laying off of staff members, causing newsrooms to bleed numbers, where you have a small number of journalists expected to cover a large amount of news. Something is going to fall through the cracks. And so I think it's time, for us as a fraternity to go back to the drawing table and say that even in the current times that we are experiencing today, how do we as a media continue to protect our integrity?
Yeah. Jovial, and that's an interesting point that Khanyi brings in there, and that is the issue of credibility, factual reporting. Just on the back of that, I do spend some time on social media, and I do see that there are some questions about the media and whether or not certain agendas are pushed through the media. And of course, as I said to Khanyi, these kinds of issues do attack the sort of credibility of, journalism space, the media. And that might be, partly the reason why people are going, yeah, you know what, we're not trusting that source. We're going to stay away from, reading this particular paper. And of course, that then goes to, the numbers dwindling where people are not even buying the paper anymore. What would you say to media practitioners in terms of, whether it is they are pushing certain agendas and where they sort of create a situation where, it makes it look bad for all of us in the space, and nobody wants to hold any of us actually credible? Jovial?
Flo, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Flo, I don't know if you can hear me. You disappeared for a second there. But I think, as Khanyi was saying, our credibility is the only thing that we sell, and it's the only thing that we should protect with everything that we have. If you take an example of the situation now with the outbreak of COVID-19, we as the media pass on to the ordinary people out there information that they need to use to stay healthy and stay alive. So it is important that when people get information from the media about whatever it is, that people believe the information is true. So the media has got to continuously take steps to make sure that their credibility is unquestioned, that the confidence of ordinary people in the media increase. And if there are instances that introduce doubt, those must be tackled immediately. Because the role of the media is to deepen democracy by giving people information that will help them make decisions about their own lives, and that information has got to be taken through a process that Khanyi was outlining earlier, which makes sure that by the time that information is published, whoever it comes from, that information is tested and taken through the journalism mechanism, quality checks, to make sure that when it goes out, that it is what it should be. And that should apply to every medium. The advent of social media, it's beautiful, it's changed our life immeasurably. But what is important is that the journalism has not changed. The mediums have changed. Maybe the speed has changed, but it does not mean that we must cut corners. Even if your item has got to be up in the next 30 seconds, if you can do journalism on that piece of information in 30 seconds, so be it. But the risking and cutting corners always comes back to bite you.
All right, Jovial Rantao, Khanyi Magubane, we appreciate your time so very much. Many thanks to both of you for joining us here on SA Today.